Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Amber Belin. Amber Marie Belin was born on December 6, 1981 in San Antonio. As an only child, her parents described her as energetic, ambitious, and responsible. For almost 3 years, Amber worked as a manager at the video game store. On January 29th, she was scheduled to work another shift. The store was set to open at 10 a.m., but Amber always arrived at 9 a.m. to prepare. Part of her routine involved taking the previous day's earnings from the safe and depositing them at the adjacent bank to avoid accumulating large sums of money in the store. On a January day, Amber arrived at work around 9 a.m. as usual. The store, part of a large international chain, was supposed to open at 10 a.m. However, by noon, Amber still hadn't opened the store or deposited the money, which raised concerns. In addition, she wasn't answering phone calls. The regional manager asked the manager of another San Antonio store, Mariano Rivera, to investigate why Amber hadn't deposited the money and why the store remained closed. When Rivera arrived, he saw a white car similar to Amber's parked outside. The store entrance was locked and he couldn't see anyone inside. After knocking on the door without getting a response, he left. About 2 hours later, Rivera returned to check on the store again. This time, he spotted Amber's assistant, Brandon, through the window. Rivera knocked on the door and Brandon let him in. Rivera asked Brandon if he had seen Amber, but Brandon said he hadn't. Brandon mentioned that he had just arrived and noticed something strange. Money, CDs, and work documents were scattered all over the floor. Rivera entered the back room and made a horrifying discovery. The lifeless body of Amber lay on the floor, face down, with a plastic bag over her head. Forensic experts later determined that the cause of her death was strangulation. Rivera immediately called 911, and the police soon cordoned off the store. Detectives found that Amber had not delivered money to the bank as she normally would, and the store's safe was empty, suggesting that a robbery had taken place and gone wrong. It's possible that the robbers stumbled upon Amber and decided to eliminate her as a witness. Based on Amber's schedule, the crime was determined to have occurred between 9 and 10 a.m. Unfortunately, the store lacked surveillance cameras, which could have greatly aided the investigation. As a result, the police had to rely on other clues. First, detectives interviewed Mariano Rivera and Brandon Beal, the two individuals who stumbled upon the body. They recounted how they arrived at the store and the circumstances surrounding their discovery of Amber's lifeless body. Store management reported to the authorities that the safe had been robbed of approximately $2,000 and several items were missing, including a few video game CDs and 3 or 4 PlayStation consoles. The total damages to the store amounted to $6,000. The police also questioned employees from neighboring establishments, but their efforts yielded no valuable information, as no one claimed to have seen or heard anything unusual. Meanwhile, as the police investigated the crime scene, news of the incident spread rapidly throughout San Antonio, and the parking lot in front of the store became flooded with media representatives. Amber's father, Randy Belin, was watching the news when he heard about the incident. The address of the store where the crime occurred caught his attention, so he immediately got in his car and drove there. When he arrived, he spoke to a detective who broke the devastating news that the victim was his daughter. This event had a profound impact on Randy, dividing his life into 2 distinct periods, before and after. Soon, Amber's mother, Lelia, arrived at the store. She looked into her husband's eyes and understood the unthinkable. Their only child was gone. The detectives examined the crime scene and concluded that the criminal had escaped through the back door, which explained why no one had seen him. Their main finding was that the criminal must have been familiar with the store's schedule, knowing that the money was taken to the bank between 9 and 10 a.m., and that this particular store didn't have surveillance cameras. This level of knowledge suggested that the criminal was likely a former or current employee of the company. The initial suspect in Amber's disappearance was Brandon Beal, her store assistant. He was familiar with the store's operations and was already on the premises when a manager from another location arrived to check on Amber. Brandon had arrived at work to find the store still closed, despite it being several hours past the opening time. Using his key, he entered the store and relocked the door. Upon entering, he noticed signs of a struggle, but curiously, he didn't investigate the back room to check on Amber's whereabouts or well-being. Further investigation revealed that Amber, as the store manager, had been dissatisfied with Brandon's performance and wanted him fired. She had confided in her mother that Brandon had a short temper and struggled to fulfill his job responsibilities. The question detectives sought to answer was whether Brandon's disagreements with Amber could have driven him to commit a crime. After receiving a warrant, officers searched Brandon's car and home in an effort to locate the stolen CDs and PlayStation consoles from the store. However, they did not find any of the missing items. During the interrogation, Brandon explained that he arrived at the store around 2 p.m. and was surprised to find it still closed. He claimed that he let himself in using his key as he didn't think Amber could be inside. Upon seeing the mess, he assumed the store had been robbed and was shortly followed by the manager from another location. Brandon also admitted that he was unaware of Amber's intention to fire him, although he acknowledged that they often disagreed on certain issues. His girlfriend and parents corroborated his alibi for the morning of the crime, and after successfully passing a lie detector test, he was cleared as a suspect. Almost a month had passed since Amber's death, but the police still had no new leads. The detectives were worried that the case would go cold. Desperate for a breakthrough, Amber's parents reached out to the public through the media, pleading with anyone who knew anything about the incident to come forward. They offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest, with $95,000 of that amount provided by Amber's employer. Flyers with her picture were posted throughout San Antonio. Yet despite these efforts, there was no progress for the next 7 months. Then, suddenly, a police station received a crucial call. A man identifying himself as Joe told the detective handling Amber's case that he knew who was responsible for her murder. Joe claimed that 22-year-old Giovanni Rivera was the killer. When the detective asked why he thought so, Joe explained that he and Giovanni had worked with Amber at the same company. On the day of the crime, Giovanni had called him, asking if he wanted to take part in a robbery. Joe revealed that the targeted store, Choice, was no accident. Giovanni had chosen it because it lacked surveillance cameras. The detective asked Joe if he had accepted the offer and participated in the robbery, but Joe denied it. If everything said so far is true, the police's initial theory that the crime was committed by someone familiar with the store's schedule is likely correct. The detective asked Joe to come to the police station to make a formal statement, but Joe refused. However, 2 days later, Joe voluntarily went to the station and maintained his innocence in the robbery. During the questioning, Joe detailed how Giovanni Rivera first discussed robbing a store. Joe claimed that Giovanni never mentioned harming Amber. But about a month after Amber's death, which had received widespread media attention, Giovanni confessed to Joe that he was responsible for her death. Joe explained that he didn't immediately report Giovanni because he feared for his safety. The $100,000 reward for providing crucial information might have encouraged Joe to come forward sooner. Joe claimed that his growing sense of guilt eventually outweighed his fear, prompting him to contact the police. Although Joe's testimony alone wasn't enough to secure an arrest warrant for Giovanni Rivera, it led the detective to call Giovanni in for questioning. Interestingly, Giovanni Rivera and Mariano Rivera, the manager who discovered the body, are simply namesakes with no family connection. During a conversation with the detective, Rivera claimed that Joe was lying and asserted he was not involved in any criminal activity. However, at a certain point, he declined to answer further questions, and the police were forced to release him. As the officers pondered how to bring him to justice, Giovanni relocated to Laredo, Texas, with his family. Being a border city with Mexico, there was a significant risk that he would cross the border and disappear. In the absence of substantial evidence, detectives were unable to take any action, and the case remained stagnant for months. Fortunately, help arrived unexpectedly at the end of June 2008, nearly a year and a half after Amber's tragic death. It was Veronica, Giovanni's wife, who reached out to the police. In her distress call, she revealed that her husband had attacked her, threatening her and their kids with a pistol. Moreover, she courageously implicated Giovanni in Amber Belkin's murder. The detective in charge of the case traveled to Laredo to interview Veronica in person. During their meeting, Veronica shared her regret over marrying Giovanni, citing that she had made a poor decision. She had become pregnant with his child while still in school, and her family had pressured them into getting married. However, after the wedding, Giovanni's true nature unfolded. He transformed into a tyrant. Veronica alleged that if she refused his advances, he would restrain her with duct tape. She also disclosed that when Giovanni was first called to the police station, he returned home agitated and abruptly instructed her that they needed to relocate to Laredo. That same day, they hastily packed their essentials and left San Antonio behind. Veronica realized that if her husband was exonerated, they wouldn't have to relocate. One day, she mustered the courage to ask Giovanni directly if he was responsible for Amber Belkin's death, and to her horror, he confessed to taking Amber's life. Stunned, Veronica demanded to know why he did it. Giovanni's response was that their family desperately needed the money to pay the rent. When Veronica subsequently asked for a divorce, Giovanni became violent, forcing her into a car and driving her to a remote location. There, he pulled out a pistol and threatened her. He then coerced her into performing sexual acts against her will. Afterward, he removed her from the car, handed her the gun, and instructed her to kill him. Veronica categorically refused, prompting Giovanni to threaten retaliation against their children and relatives if she didn't comply. Veronica pleaded with Giovanni to consider the fate of their children if they were left parentless, and her words seemed to have an impact. That evening, they both returned home, but the next morning, Giovanni threatened to vanish. As soon as Veronica drove away, she contacted the police and reported her husband's admission of guilt. The authorities obtained an arrest warrant for Giovanni, but he managed to escape across the border into Mexico. It took 6 weeks of searching before he was finally apprehended at a relative's residence. The Mexican authorities agreed to hand him over to the U.S., but only on the condition that the prosecutors would not seek the death penalty. During questioning, Giovanni confessed to the murder of Amber Belkin. He explained that, as soon as Amber opened the store door, he followed her, wearing gloves and a mask. Amber recognized him, and he told her he was in financial trouble and needed money. He forced her to open the safe, and when she attempted to reach the phone, he bound her hands with duct tape. Amber panicked, screaming, and Giovanni covered her mouth, asking her to remain quiet. Realizing he had gone too far, he placed a plastic bag over her head, asphyxiating her until she stopped breathing. He then stole the money, some CDs, and PlayStation consoles before driving away. After a prolonged and challenging process, the district attorney's office finally agreed to a plea bargain. In April 2010, Giovanni Rivera was subsequently sentenced to life in prison, with the stipulation that he must serve at least 30 years behind bars before he can be considered for parole. Amber's loved ones and friends vowed to do everything within their power to guarantee that he remains incarcerated for the rest of his life. Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you, the case of Kimberly Antonakos. The case that happened in 1995 in New York is about sacrifice and openness to the world, which became fatal for 21-year-old Kimberly Antonakos. The heroine of today's story is a beautiful girl with a good heart who could not have imagined, even in a terrible dream, what horror life had prepared for her. Her father, Thomas Antonakos, a successful businessman, learned of his daughter's disappearance from her co-workers. When Kimberly failed to show up for work, they contacted him, as her punctuality and good standing made her absence a bad sign. The worried father couldn't reach her, as she always answered her rare, expensive cell phone he had gifted her, so he contacted her friends, who had not seen her since the early morning hours of March 1st. Thomas did not wait and went to the police after learning Kimberly was missing. Officials advised waiting 24 hours as she may have stayed with someone. Unsatisfied, Thomas conducted his own investigation. A psychic, approached by the mother, claimed Kimberly was alive but weak, kidnapped by acquaintances she tried to escape. The psychic also said deadly danger came from several people, one whose name began with J. Kimberly was born in 1974 in New York, USA. She was the only child in the family. Although the girl grew up in a loving and affluent environment, she was not spoiled. Her parents came from humble backgrounds. Nevertheless, her father, Thomas, managed to achieve considerable success. He created his own company that was engaged in computers and earned funds which he was happy to spend on his beloved daughter and her wishes. When Kim was a little girl, the Antonakos couple got divorced. The child was left to live with her mother. However, this did not weaken the connection between Kimberly and Thomas. He took her on weekends and spent all his free time with her. When Kimberly's mother found a new partner and decided to move to Florida, the girl faced a choice to stay with her mother or with her father. Since she did not want to move and felt as wonderful with her dad as with her mom, the young lady preferred to live in familiar conditions, so Kim began living with her father, with whom she was very close. She grew up to be a well-mannered and sociable child. In 1994, the girl became a student at the College of Staten Island. Soon after, she informed her father that she felt old enough to live independently. Undoubtedly, Mr. Antonakos was concerned about her decision, but he respected it and decided not to oppose it. Then, he promised himself to secure her separate living arrangements as much as possible. Therefore, Thomas purchased a nice apartment for his daughter in an affluent area of the city. He even equipped her dwelling with an alarm system. To ensure she didn't have to park far from home, the man bought a space in the garage across the street. To keep her in constant communication, he provided her with a cell phone and a pager. Kimberly performed well academically and also worked part-time. She declined her father's offer to carry on the family business because she wanted to forge her own path. Kimberly secured a part-time job as an accountant at a thriving firm. During this period, she led a typical student lifestyle, frequently socializing and attending social gatherings. Her father persistently urged her to return, but she steadfastly refused, motivated by her aspiration for independence. In early 1995, Kimberly sheltered her friend Liz Pace and her family in her home as their apartment was being renovated. Out of the kindness of her heart, Kimberly offered her spacious lodging. They had fun, cooking together, and spending evenings together. On one such day, Kimberly and her friend decided to go to a party. They got ready, and Kimberly drove them home in her white 1994 Honda Accord. However, she did not go up to the apartment, citing unfinished business. The girls embraced and never saw each other again. The first place Mr. Antonakos went to after the police was the parking lot next to his daughter's house. However, the car was missing from the garage. Near the wall on the floor, the man noticed a shiny object, which turned out to be a small gold earring. The father remembered that he had given his daughter similar ones, and just in case, he took them with him. Kimberly wasn't in the apartment either. He only came across guests, a friend, her boyfriend Joshua Torres, and their joint 2-year-old child. Thomas was aware of the decision, but did not favor it. The tenants were also surprised by the absence of the hostess and worried about her. Joshua reported that he was searching for Kimberly and offered to assist. Later, Thomas returned to the police station. He stated that his daughter had been in an accident, but the officers remained firm in their stance. The distressed father decided to communicate once more with Liz, who was the last person to have seen Kim. The man presented the discovered jewelry, and the girl confirmed that she had seen those earrings on Kim the night of the disappearance. Next, Mr. Antonakos visited the places where his daughter often went. There, he talked to many people but did not find anything important. Joshua, in turn, offered to look not only for Kimberly but also for the car, which was very conspicuous. Then, Thomas went to the police for the third time. This time, he was determined, informing the law enforcement officers that he would not go anywhere until they went on a search. One of the detectives responded to the appeal of the agitated father. Despite the procedure, he said he would take up the investigation. The first thing he did was to reconstruct the events of February 28th. Miss Antonakos went to college in the morning, then to work afterward. After working a few hours, she came home where, together with friends, she had dinner and then attended a party with Liz around 4 a.m. The girls arrived home after that. Kim then went to the parking lot, but what urgent business she had at such an early time was not possible to find out. The apartment and garage of Kimberly were searched, but no evidence or traces of a struggle were found. No foreign fingerprints were discovered, suggesting that someone made an effort to clean the scene or the intruder wore gloves. The car and driver seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The only concern was the earring that was found. Her bank account was also analyzed, and it was found that the last time she used her bank card was the evening before her disappearance. The theory of Kimberly running away from home was ruled out. The detective's theory was that she had been kidnapped. At this point, other police officers joined the investigation. Due to the lack of other solid leads, law enforcement unofficially adhered to the information Mrs. Antonakos received from the psychic. It is not uncommon for authorities to cooperate with people who have psychic abilities, as such involvement has sometimes yielded positive results, though it is not widely publicized. Witness interviews followed, and the first people questioned were Liz and Joshua. Officers learned that 65 calls had been made from Kimberly's landline on the morning of March 1st. Joshua explained that he had been calling all his friends and acquaintances, hoping to figure out where Kim had gone and why she hadn't spent the night at home. Thanks to Liz's testimony, it was possible to determine what clothes Kim was wearing. A portrait was drawn up to be published. Distinctive features on the girl's body were her tattoos, one in the form of a scorpion, her zodiac sign, and another on her waist, representing an infinity sign in the form of two naked people in parallel. There was a search for the missing car, checking all the scrap metal collection points and other places where the vehicle could be to be disassembled for parts or sale, but with no positive result. A check of the girl's cell phone was also unsuccessful. Police officers told Thomas he should have paid attention to the letters and phone calls he was receiving, as his daughter's kidnappers could have contacted him and offered a ransom. However, the Antonakos family remained in limbo until March 4th. Around 2 a.m. on March 4th, emergency services received a report of a fire. A large abandoned house at 86 Woodhaven Avenue in Queens was burning. When the fire was finally extinguished, a charred body was found in the basement. Forensic experts determined the deceased was a woman aged 20 to 25, with traces of tape on her head and her legs bound, her hands tied behind her back. She had been alive during the fire, as evidenced by her smoke-filled lungs. She had been burned alive. Detectives hypothesized that the body belonged to the missing Kimberly, but dental records were needed for full identification. The ashes were inspected, and the smell of gasoline was detected, indicating the house had been deliberately set on fire to destroy evidence of a serious crime. Examining the charred corpse, the specialists found tattoos matching the description of the missing woman. Dental records confirmed the body was that of Kimberly Antonakos. Investigators decided to question Joshua again, as there was something they didn't write about the guy. By a strange coincidence, his name also began with the letter J. This time, Joshua talked about a guy he hadn't reached the day Kimberly disappeared. It was a young man nicknamed Psycho, a Russian national who had once dated Kimberly. Detectives decided to verify the information. They determined that the Russian had moved to the United States with his parents as a young child. Having grown up, he became a member of a gang and repeatedly broke the law. So, in the case, the first suspect appeared, who was soon detained. During the interrogation, Psycho became aware of the death of a former lover. However, his reaction shocked the detectives. The young man did not just claim that he was not involved in the crime, he was heartbroken. It was clear that he was experiencing genuine emotions. Investigators also wanted to see how he would behave at a crime scene, so they took him to the scene of the tragedy. There, everyone was convinced that they had the wrong man in custody. In addition, after some time, the guy's alibi was confirmed. Once again, the investigation was deadlocked. The victim's family decided to turn to the psychic once again. This time, the psychic said that she saw 4 people involved in the crime. She also said that the kidnappers wanted to establish contact, but they failed to do so. A couple of days later, hoping to get some information, the missing woman's father announced a $10,000 reward to anyone who would help catch the culprit. Mr. Antonakos could not forget the words spoken by the clairvoyant. If he had been told earlier that he would rely on some fortune tellers and soothsayers, he would never have believed it. The man went over in his mind his daughter's kidnapper's words about wanting to get in touch. He wondered what that meant and what was preventing them. Then he returned home and sat down at the table. He stared at his phone for a long time as he suddenly remembered a minor detail from the day Kimberly disappeared. He had listened to all the answering machine recordings, as he had been expecting his daughter to contact him. However, there had been no voicemails except perhaps 2 blank ones. When he turned them on, he heard nothing, just dead silence on the other end of the handset. He had mistaken this for a device malfunction or communication problems, but it later turned out that this was not the case. 5 days after the girl's body was discovered, officers managed to locate her car. It was parked in a fairly quiet area of town, not far from the crime scene. The investigation hoped to find fingerprints in the car, but the vehicle was well washed. The only evidence was Kimberly's hair and a second earring in the passenger compartment. It seemed like a breakthrough in the investigation, but it did not happen. At the same time, Kimberly's father was being implicated in a local mob-related killing. Allegedly, such a wealthy and successful man was clearly associated with the criminal underworld. Some of the man's entourage even blamed him for the death of his daughter, as if his shady activities had brought trouble upon her. The grief-stricken father denied any involvement. Through their own channels, detectives were able to verify the information circulating. However, it was not confirmed that Thomas was innocent and conducted his business transparently. In July 1995, a young man was arrested by the police in a New York City home for burglary. Unexpectedly, he provided information concerning the case of Miss Antonakos. The detainee claimed that he had heard from an acquaintance that his friends had kidnapped and then burned the girl. When the officers heard the name of the unidentified man, the picture of the crime finally emerged. It was none other than Joshua Torres, the same guy who lived in Kimberly's apartment and helped in the search for her. Detectives decided to take a closer look at him. Joshua was called back in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the crime. However, during a long conversation, he gave himself away. Joshua said that if he had been the kidnapper, he would have fed Kim. Detectives latched onto that line because there was no coverage of the victim dying of hunger, thirst, or cold. No one outside the investigation knew that, not even her father. However, they needed more evidence, and it didn't take them long. Officers looked into the identity of the new suspect. It was found that the person had a criminal record and was repeatedly arrested. In addition, he did not work anywhere and lived at the expense of his roommate Liz while the girl worked. The calls Joshua made that morning were analyzed, and it became obvious that he was lying when he said he was calling Kimberly's contacts. Most of the numbers belonged to random people with no connection to Kimberly. After examining his pager data, it was discovered that the person had sent some strange messages on March 1st. The investigation was gradually closing in on Joshua. He had been under suspicion by the detectives for a long time, and they finally obtained solid leads to apprehend him. They admitted to him that they no longer considered Kimberly's ex-boyfriend a suspect, and once again, they pressed the case intelligently. That's when Joshua said he suspected his friends of murdering Kimberly. He pleaded guilty to being an accessory to kidnapping, but he claimed that he did not think his accomplices would eventually decide to eliminate her. According to him, they just wanted to get the ransom and then release the victim, but the plan didn't work. The kidnappers were puzzled by Mr. Antonakos' lack of response to their calls. They had contacted Kimberly's father and even recorded a ransom message, but the recording was not saved on the answering machine for some unknown reason. Angered by the father's inaction, the kidnappers decided to wait and see how the case would unfold. They were not only unnerved by the media attention, but also by the clairvoyant's claim that the suspect's name began with the letter J. This detail had been published in the media and also mentioned on TV, citing an additional unofficial source of information. It's a vicious circle. One action spawned another. After speaking with the police, Joshua was released on bail and then disappeared. At the same time, his accomplice Jose was shot in the back of the head while walking with his wife. His wife later admitted to investigators that her husband did not trust Joshua, used a tape recorder when talking to him, and wanted to expose him. She claimed he felt guilty about kidnapping Kimberly, but he didn't set the house on fire and soon wanted to confess everything to the police, as he had confessed to her. Thanks to the pager messages and the suspect's statements, investigators were able to establish the details of the kidnapping and the crime. They found that 4 men were involved: Joshua Torres, Julio Negron, Jose Negron, Julio's namesake, and Nicholas Brett, nicknamed Jay. Notably, Julio had dated Kimberly for a while and even wanted to marry her, but she rejected his proposal. The young people were connected by the fact that they were friends and had a criminal history. However, their previous criminal activities did not compare to what the men did to Kimberly. Nicholas had been released on bail shortly before the kidnapping, thanks to his mother, who got him off with a small fine for a crime that could have sentenced him to more than a year in prison. As for Joshua, at a young age, he was involved in cases of child abduction, violence against a minor, and illegal carrying of weapons. However, he too was limited to a light sentence for the acts committed. The initiator of the crime was undoubtedly him. It was Joshua who coordinated the group's actions. After Kimberly returned from the party, the men grabbed her in the parking lot. Apparently, they had been following her and waiting for the perfect moment to leave her alone. A gun was used for intimidation. Kim resisted, so her hands were tied, and her mouth, eyes, and even ears were covered with duct tape. After that, the bandits put the girl in the trunk and drove her to an abandoned house. There, they took the unfortunate woman to the basement and tied her to a chair. They even removed her shoes so that she would not attract attention to herself by tapping her feet. Before this, they told Kimberly that her father owed money and they would release her after he had paid them. Julio was supposed to look after the girl, bring her food and water twice a day, and make sure she was warm. However, he was afraid of the consequences and left the house. As it happened, the victim did not eat or drink for 3 days and also froze from the cold. He made an audio recording in which he demanded $775,000 as ransom. Then the guy called the girl's father and left 2 messages, which later turned out to be empty, so they were not taken into account by Mr. Antonakos. The kidnappers waited for news and sincerely did not understand why Kim's father did not get in touch with them. During this time, Kimberly was left unattended, passed out from dehydration more than once, but she was still fighting for her life. The criminals were angry that they had not received the ransom, and they were afraid of being caught, so they decided to let her go. When they went down to the basement, they found the girl unconscious. Deciding that Kimberly was dead, they thought of nothing better than to get rid of all the evidence, and at the same time, the hostage. In talking to Liz, the officers discovered that Joshua had used his roommate as an alibi. He directed the actions of the accomplices while in the house with the child. Liz claimed that at first, she did not even realize that her boyfriend had kidnapped Kimberly. Later, at trial, Liz testified against him. She said that after the interrogation, Joshua came to her and confessed to everything. After that, he beat her and silenced her, threatening to kill her, and soon went on the run. Sometime later, the perpetrator was arrested. He was also suspected of killing Jose, but there was no direct evidence of this. Investigators decided to confront the former friends. They informed them that Joshua denied his involvement in the massacre. When Julio learned about it, he cooperated with the investigation and told everything. This allowed Joshua to be convicted of Kimberly's murder. As a result, the trio was charged with murder, arson, kidnapping, and holding a person against his will. During the trial, it was found that Joshua had repeatedly tried to mislead the investigation and avoid punishment. The jury deliberated for about 10 hours. In the end, Joshua Torres was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Nicholas Brett received the same sentence. Julio Negron was only found guilty of accessory after the fact, and he was sentenced to between 2 and 6 years in prison. Thomas Antonakos was satisfied with the verdict of the court. He did not want the criminals to be sentenced to death, as in his opinion, it would have been the lightest punishment. It is known that Nicholas was repeatedly abused and assaulted in prison, and after 2 years, he died of AIDS. Julio was released after 2 years, having served his sentence. Joshua will not be released until 2053 at the earliest, if he lives to see it. Sadly, in 2005, the victim's father died of cancer. His family is sure that the disease provoked the terrible death of his daughter. This is how unexpectedly cut short the life of a beautiful girl, Kimberly Antonakos. Whether excessive good-naturedness was the cause of her premature departure is difficult to judge. However, if she had been more prudent and choosy in her surroundings, perhaps she would have lived a long and happy life. Good always triumphs over evil, even in a case like this. The trial that took place in life afterwards set things right, and the perpetrators of the tragedy are severely punished and are unlikely to ever forget what they have done.
The case of Sheila Labar, a monster with an angelic appearance. Psychological and physical traumas received at an early age can have a very unpredictable effect on adult life. Of course, far from always, they lead to the fact that a person becomes cruel and seeks to hurt others. But sometimes it is the trauma can give rise to a real monster. Criminal psychologist Adrian Rain believes that there are genetic and psychophysical mechanisms that can turn a person into a cold-blooded killer, about which he wrote in detail in his book, Anatomy of Violence. History knows a lot of serial criminals who had a truly hellish childhood, and perhaps to them can be attributed our heroine today, Sheila Labar. This woman had an angelic appearance which she skillfully used, seducing her victims and then brutally murdered them. Despite the fact that the court was able to prove only 2 of her crimes, criminologists are sure that there were many more. And now let's look at this difficult story from the beginning and try to understand whether Sheila Labar was a born monster or became him as a result of the cruelty that she faced in childhood. Who is Sheila Labar? Sheila Labar was born in 1958, the 4th of July, in the small country town of Fort Payne, Alabama. She was the youngest of 3 children of her parents and was raised with her brother and sister Lynn. Her childhood was spent in a picturesque but rather secluded place, on a farm nestled among cornfields. According to the memories of Lynn's older sibling, Sheila was an active, inquisitive, and open-minded girl with a creative streak. She liked to be in the center of attention, had a good voice and cute appearance, so perhaps, if her life had turned out differently, she would have become a famous actress or singer. But instead of bright posters, her name decorated the pages of criminal chronicles. The unimaginable cruelty of her father. The head of the family, Manuel Bailey, for many years suffered from alcohol addiction, although it would be more accurate to say that his addiction suffered from his entire family. He often went on binges, turning into a real beast who enjoyed abusing his wife and children. He insulted and humiliated them, beat them with anything that came to hand, could throw everyone out in the middle of the night in a downpour or frost, and locked himself in the house, not letting anyone inside. Mothers, daughters, and sons often had to spend the night in a barn or in the open air in the field. One day, when Manuel was once again in a drunken rage, he began throwing dishes and other objects at his family members. The mother tried to cover the children as best she could, but one of the flower pots thrown by her husband hit her youngest daughter, Sheila, in the head. Sheila suffered a serious concussion and a lifelong scar on her temple, which she painstakingly covered with her hair. But not even the insults and beatings were the worst thing that the sisters had to endure in their parents' home. According to the memories of Sheila and Lynn, Manuel from an early age forcibly inclined them to intimacy. The mother may have been aware of what was going on, but the subject was never broached. However, despite the nightmare at home, Sheila did well enough in school. She dreamed of leaving the farm as soon as possible and go to conquer the big city. The girl was quite ambitious and determined. She passionately wanted to realize her childhood dream in life and become an actress or pop singer. And she had everything for this: charisma, bright appearance, and a beautiful voice, adulthood, first marriage. Barely Sheila was 18 years old. She left her parents' home, but adult life was not so joyful. To enter the university, she was not allowed to average score, and to move to the big city, she simply did not have the money. Then Sheila got a job as a maid in one of the hotels, where by that time her older sister was already working. It should be noted that Sheila had a slender figure and a very attractive appearance. She had big blue eyes, a charming smile, and a mop of thick long hair. She was surrounded by attention from men, and over time, she learned to use it and manipulate her suitors. In the late 70s, Labar, then Bailey, met a guy named Jonathan Baxter, and a romantic relationship began between them. Jonathan was not yet 20 years old at the time, but he already had a young daughter from a previous relationship. However, the child did not become a hindrance, and soon the couple got married. However, this marriage lasted only a few months and collapsed after Jonathan learned that the young wife abused his daughter while he disappeared at work. Sheila was frankly annoyed with the child, and she would raise her hand or lock her in a closet if she started crying or acting up. Jonathan did not organize scandals and listen to explanations. He just Strazoot filed for divorce and put his wife with his belongings outside his house. He never wanted to see or hear from her again. After the divorce, Sheila dated various men and mostly lived off them. But all these relationships were fleeting and lasted from a few weeks to a couple of months, until in the early 80s she met her future second husband, Ronnie Jennings. The tumultuous romance soon led to marriage, and Sheila took on a double last name, Bailey Jennings. It was an unhealthy relationship between two irascible and unstable people who regularly cheated on each other, scandalized, and even fought. Still, their marriage lasted more than 3 years. In 1984, after another family quarrel, Sheila demanded a divorce from her husband, but he refused her. In fact, Ronnie did not hold on to the relationship at all. He just wanted to piss off his wife and make her mad, and he succeeded. Sheila became hysterical, took a large number of drugs in front of her husband, drinking strong alcohol, and after this infernal cocktail, sat behind the wheel of the car and rushed down the road. Naturally, soon Sheila, under the influence of pills and alcohol, lost consciousness, flew off the road, and at high speed crashed into a tree. She miraculously survived, but suffered a massive head injury. She spent more than a week in a deep coma, and doctors made no prognosis. When Sheila finally regained consciousness and gradually recovered, she was transferred to a psychiatric hospital where she spent several months. She later complained to her sister that one of the orderlies was constantly harassing her and possibly taking advantage of her helpless state when she was heavily sedated. After all this, Sheila returned to her second husband's home, but began to behave not just aggressively, but threateningly toward him. When during another scandal she attacked Ronnie and poked him in the chest with nail scissors, Ronnie, fearing for his own life and health, filed for divorce and hurriedly moved out of the mad woman. Rich lover. When the second marriage was dissolved, the young woman began looking for lovers through the dating columns of the print media, and she left her ads there as well. But no man did not stay with her for long. because Sheila tended to dominate everything, rigidly suppressing their partners, both in intimate and everyday life. Soon the photo of an attractive girl in the dating section drew the attention of 60-year-old Wilfred Bill Labar. The man had previously been married twice and had adult children and grandchildren from previous marriages. He was widowed a few years ago and had been living alone on his large country ranch ever since. Bill was a fairly wealthy man. He had a chiropractic office in Epping, New Hampshire, and on the ranch he raised horses. At the same time, he was very lonely and needed a strong, powerful woman. In fact, that's exactly what he found. Sheila was attracted by the wealth of her new acquaintance, and she decided that it would be an ideal union for her. And to make Bill completely lost his head, she began to send him a postal mail frank letters, supplementing them with her nude photos. The trap worked, and soon Labar invited a charming pen pal to visit his ranch. Their romance developed rapidly. An elderly man is not stingy on expensive gifts for a young mistress, and in the summer of 1987, she moved to live with him. This has incredibly flattered the doctor, who now went out in public with a beautiful companion who was half his age and was fit for him as a daughter. Nevertheless, he did not plan to marry Sheila. However, Sheila, not waiting for a marriage proposal, changed her name, calling herself Labar. Bill was surprised by this turn of events, but he did not object. Sheila began to interfere in all the affairs of her elderly lover, starting to control his business, finances, and disposition of his property. In addition, Bill was getting older and could not satisfy the intimate needs of a young woman. Then, according to Sheila herself, he allowed her to meet other men, whom she often brought directly to their home. One of Sheila's regular lovers, closer to the mid-90s, was a Jamaican national named Wayne Ennis. He was much younger than Sheila and was initially hired as an au pair on the ranch, but soon the young man, with Bill's consent, which was probably given under pressure from Sheila, moved to live in the owner's house. In 1995, Sheila and Wayne officially legalized their relationship, and the spouse considered that from now on, he would be her only man. But soon he realized that he was wrong, because his wife continued to meet with different men. Wayne was not satisfied with this, and one day he jumped with fists on Sheila and her next lover, causing them bodily harm. Accustomed to being dominated, Sheila for the first time didn't know how to deal with her third husband, who got into a fight every time a rival appeared on the horizon. Eventually, she filed for divorce and sought a court injunction to stop Wayne from approaching her, accusing him of violence and assault. Another divorce did not affect the turbulent personal life of Sheila, who continued to meet with numerous lovers, changing them like gloves. True, now her relationship increasingly often began to end with lawsuits from men who accused Sheila not just in cruelty, but also in the threat to their lives and health. Thus, one of her boyfriends she deliberately hit by a car and almost ran over. Another almost broke his head, and another scratched his face so that he was forever scarred. Sheila, with age, became more and more dangerous to others. From every man she demanded obedience, and in cases of disobedience, fell into a rage. In 2000, at the age of 74, Bill Labar died of heart failure. Although doctors and police officers did not see a criminal trail in the death of an elderly man, his family members were convinced that Sheila had something to do with it. In their opinion, she had been poisoning Bill little by little for years, and literally drove him into the light. Despite the fact that Bill and Sheila were never officially married, Sheila, according to the will, became the sole heiress of all his property. The relatives tried to challenge this through the courts, but never got anywhere. They are still convinced that the mistress forced Bill to write the will she wanted. House of Temptation. After Bill's death, as I have already mentioned, all his property came under Sheila's complete control. Now she no longer had to consider anyone's opinion. She could do whatever she wanted with the estate she had inherited. She herself called her home a place of seduction and pleasure, where there were no inhibitions. She met men on the streets, in bars, on the internet, lured them to her, and then tried to keep them on the ranch as long as possible. She didn't care about their age, skin color, or any physical appearance. She promised them unearthly pleasure, and then sought to suppress and subjugate them to her will. Sheila regularly tried to seduce couriers by meeting them in the nude and offering an alternative method of payment. But she didn't take into account the fact that she herself was not getting any younger and was nowhere near as attractive as she used to be. It got to the point where couriers simply refused to come to her address. Neighbors noticed that on the ranch Labar constantly come different men, but some hurried to leave the place the same day. Others were delayed, but also for a short time. What was going on in the house itself could only be guessed at. Where had Michael DeLorge disappeared to? Soon, Sheila decided to look for lovers among men who were in dire need of housing, money, or those men who suffered from addiction. This category was the most vulnerable and proved to be an easy prey for the cunning woman, who everywhere posed as a widowed millionaire and talked about her untold wealth inherited by her. In 2004, Labar met on one of the city streets homeless man named Michael DeLodge. He was in a difficult life situation and lost literally everything because of addiction to illegal drugs. His relatives tried to send him to a rehabilitation clinic, but he ran away from there and has been loitering ever since. Sheila liked Michael, and she invited him to her, promising shelter, food, and the necessary drugs in exchange for intimacy. Moving to the ranch, the guy was completely dependent on his old mistress. He complied with all her demands, afraid to be on the street again. But Sheila quickly got into the taste, and her desires became more and more sophisticated. She bound, beat, and humiliated Michael, taking pleasure in it. He tried to escape several times, walking dozens of miles and hiding in homeless shelters, but he never decided to go to the police for fear they wouldn't believe him. Meanwhile, Sheila found him each time and brought him back to the ranch. In desperation, he tried to contact his family members and let them know he was in trouble. His loved ones immediately responded to this disturbing news, but it was too late. In October 2005, Michael DeLorge disappeared without a trace. When his family contacted Sheila directly, she stated that she and Michael had broken up. He had left her, and his current whereabouts were unknown to her. Michael did not show up at any of the places he had been to before. No one who knew him had seen him, and there was no way to contact him. Contacting the police was fruitless, and Labar remained beyond suspicion, trusting Kenny County. Sheila's tales of her exorbitant wealth were greatly exaggerated, and the house and automobile had to be maintained, so she was forced to get a job. Naturally, Sheila chose an occupation to her liking. She became an operator of intimate phone services. Since she had a truly enchanting voice, men fell for the bait and offered to meet her in person. Among such guys was Kenny County, who at the time of their acquaintance was barely 24 years old. The young man was attractive in appearance, very good-natured and open. However, he had a low IQ level, due to which he was very gullible. This was exactly the kind of guy Labar was looking for. Kenny was very close to his mother, on whom he actually depended, but Sheila, with the help of clever manipulations, managed to break this connection and literally lure Kenny to herself. She made him an unforgettable night of love and promised that they would be like this all the time. The young man decided that he had met the woman of his dreams, about which he informed his relatives, and then moved to live in Sheila's house. But soon Sheila showed the guy her true face, having arranged for him a real torture room in one of the rooms. Each time, intimacy inevitably turned into a brutal beating or something worse. Kenny's body was covered with bruises, abrasions, scratches, cuts, and burn marks. But he could not leave the house of the mistress who had completely subjugated his will. Sheila did not allow him to see and communicate with his loved ones, and his family could only guess what was happening to Kenny. The first alarm was raised by neighbors who periodically noticed the guy and were horrified by his sickly appearance. A few days before his disappearance, a local store clerk took a picture of the young man on her cell phone camera, and later this picture was attached to the case file in court. In the photo, Kenny's condition could be described as deplorable. He was very thin, there were huge bruises under his eye and on his cheek, and his nose was probably broken. Judging by the degree of healing, all these injuries had been inflicted at different times, which suggested that the guy had been brutally beaten for a long time. The contents of his cart were also alarming. He rolled 2 large canisters of fuel to the cash register, as it later turned out, for his own cremation. The store employees were so puzzled and even frightened by the guy's appearance that they decided to report him to the police for possible domestic violence. But this time, Sheila managed to get away with it, and they could not charge her with anything. Soon Kenny stopped contacting his family altogether, and when his worried mother arrived at Labar's house, the owner behaved aggressively and advised to leave Kenny alone. All subsequent attempts ended similarly, at which point Kenny County's family filed a missing persons report with the police, indicating that he may be being held forcibly at the country ranch, a home crematorium, and gruesome findings. When police arrived at Sheila's home, she claimed that the young man no longer lived with her, and claimed that Kenny had run away because his mother, whom he was allegedly terrified of, began visiting them frequently. As evidence, Sheila provided an audio recording in which she asks her lover if his own mother had attacked him, and he quietly gives an affirmative answer. It all seemed more than strange, and the very next day, an officer visiting Sheila secured a search warrant for the estate. Sheila had been on the police's radar many times before, and her name had been linked to another mysterious disappearance of a boyfriend. But over the years, Sheila had never been questioned, and her house and grounds had never been searched. When the police arrived, they did not find Labar at home, but they did see several fires burning near the outbuildings. The fires looked strange and were made of improvised materials, a mattress, fragments of wooden furniture, hay, etc., all doused with a flammable mixture. One of the bonfires had bones in it that clearly looked like human remains. The squad requested reinforcements in the form of forensic experts, reporting all the findings. But that turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg compared to what they discovered next. Almost all over the house were found poorly washed traces of blood. It was so much that it seemed as if there had been a real massacre. It turned out that the blood belonged to at least 3 different people. The bones smoldering in the fire belonged to the missing Kenny, and there were 2 empty fuel cans lying nearby, the same ones the boy had bought at the local store the day before. But that wasn't all. Also found on the property were the remains of Michael Delage, who had disappeared a few years earlier, and some fingers of some third guy who was never identified. Among other things, a large number of items belonging, judging by the size, to various men were fished out of the sump at the ranch, the fates of which have not been learned. The hostess herself was not at home at the time of the police visit. She had figured it out and gone on the run. Sheila hitchhiked to Boston, where she obviously hoped to get lost. Moreover, on the way, she seduced one of the drivers who gave her a ride, and he trustingly invited her to live in his house. However, the next day, having seen on TV news about the search for a dangerous criminal, the new lover himself called the police and reported that Sheila is now in his bed. It was there that she was arrested. During the search of Sheila's home, another frightening find was made, a box of videotapes. On the tapes, Kenny, Michael, and several other men confessed to horrific crimes, but judging by the guy's appearance and condition, they made these confessions under torture. Since Labar's arrest, her mental health has raised a lot of questions, so the court ordered the necessary evaluations. Sheila was found to have a delusional disorder, as well as signs of schizophrenia. She called herself an angel sent from heaven to protect children from rapists. It was Sheila's failing mental health that became the basis on which her attorney tried to build a defense. He called his client a profoundly sick person and tried to prove that she was not aware of her actions. The reason for this was the mental and physical trauma she had suffered as a child. The defendant herself claimed that many years ago, when she was in that terrible accident and found herself in a coma, on the verge of death, she met with God, and the latter told her to cleanse the world of men who infringe on children. Sheila's ex-husbands and some of Sheila's lovers also spoke in court, who, in one voice, called her a crazy, unstable, and extremely violent woman. And Wayne Annis, the third husband, said that the ex-wife repeatedly persuaded him to kill Mr. Labar in order to seize his property. But despite the defense's attempts to convince the court that Sheila was insane and in need of treatment, it was proven that she was aware of her actions at the time of her crimes. She was found guilty in July 2008 and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of ever being released. All of her appeals were rejected. Sheila is now serving her sentence in Florida at Homestead Correctional Facility.
Hello friends, welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. This narrative recounts a tragic event that occurred within an Indian family, where one person's happiness turned into another's misfortune. Jessica Patel was born on September 16, 1983. Her family resided in a Hindu community in Leeds, West Yorkshire, England. As the eldest child, she was diligent and obedient from a young age. Jessica excelled academically and helped around the house while maintaining a cheerful disposition. Jessica had many friends, but shared a special bond with me, a boy 3 years older than her. Unlike Jessica's vibrant personality, I was modest and shy. We often played together during childhood. As she grew older, Jessica blossomed into a beauty with aspirations akin to her peers. She dreamt of falling in love with a worthy man and having a happy family with many children, just like the heroes of her favorite movies. Despite her romantic fantasies, Jessica remained intelligent and purposeful. She aimed for independence and sought to establish herself in life. In 2002, she enrolled at De Montfort University in Leicester. 4 years later, she continued her pharmacy studies at the University of Manchester. During this time, Jessica reconnected with Mesh, who happened to be studying at the same faculty. Though they didn't initially see each other in person, Mesh had matured into a confident and handsome man. Gradually, their friendship blossomed into romantic feelings. Mesh often showered her with compliments and gifts, always being very attentive and caring. However, life took an unexpected turn for Jessica. Her mother succumbed to an incurable disease, leaving her grief-stricken. Mesh supported her through this tough period and didn't leave her alone with her sorrowful thoughts. Their relationship grew stronger during these trying times. Jessica even confided in her sister that she had finally found a dependable partner. It seemed like Mesh was perfect in every way. In 2008, Mesh Patel asked Jessica's father for her hand in marriage according to Hindu traditions. Her father was not particularly fond of Mesh as a candidate for his daughter's husband and felt it was too soon for marriage. But Jessica managed to convince him otherwise, and their wedding took place in July 2009 in the garden of her parental home. Initially, their married life appeared as beautiful as the wedding itself. However, soon after, Mesh's behavior changed. He became distant and cold. Jessica found herself feeling lonely and complained to her sisters about this shift in his demeanor. Their intimate life also suffered significantly. They didn't have any intimacy for about 10 months after getting married. This upset Jessica greatly. She couldn't understand what had happened to their previous feelings. In 2010, Jessica graduated from university, which gave her the chance to start a career as a pharmacist, something she looked forward to. Yet despite having higher education and a husband by her side, happiness eluded her due to Mesh's changing attitude. Mesh became increasingly controlling and suspicious, monitoring her every move closely. Another wave of tragedy hit when Jessica's grandfather fell gravely ill. His health deteriorated rapidly. Her sister Manal later revealed that Mesh did not permit Jessica to stay with or frequently visit her parents during this critical time. This caused considerable strain between the spouses. There was a conflict between the young woman and her spouse that she did not comprehend. She openly expressed her confusion to Mitesh. However, this only fueled his anger, leading him to hit the unfortunate woman in the face. Both individuals came from traditional Indian families where the head of the family makes all final decisions. Thus, she felt compelled to obey him. One day, feeling utterly lonely in her marriage, Jessica shared her concerns with her family. She suspected infidelity because every time Mitesh talked on the phone, he would go to another room and sometimes stayed up late at night alone. In 2012, her suspicions were confirmed when she accidentally discovered love correspondence on his phone. Hoping for support, Jessica confided in Mitesh's cousin, with whom she had previously communicated well. She expected help or advice to save her marriage. However, Mitesh's brother dismissed her concerns and implied it was all her fault if he was cheating. This response left Jessica without any understanding or support from her husband's relatives. Simultaneously, Mitesh forbade her from seeking solace with her own sisters. It was apparent that Mitesh was hiding something and feared losing not only his family's respect, but also that of the local community. To maintain control, he restricted his wife's communication in every possible way. In 2014, hoping for a fresh start, Mitesh and Jessica moved to Linor, a suburb of Middlesbrough in North Yorkshire, away from their families. They purchased a spacious house with many rooms and made renovations. A year later, they rented a premises where they opened their own pharmacy. Jessica believed this move would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Relations between them did improve slightly. However, they longed for children, which remained elusive. Throughout 6 years of marriage, Jessica could not conceive a child, which led Mitesh to hint at leaving if this situation did not change. In October 2015, Jessica decided to resort to IVF treatments despite previous unsuccessful attempts. The process took an emotional toll on her. She became increasingly nervous and depressed due to hormonal treatments, coupled with lack of support from Mitesh, who grew distant again. In public, he continued to pretend being a courteous husband, but reverted upon arriving home, glued to his phone and often displaying anger. The tension escalated until Jessica could no longer bear it, prompting discussions about separation as a potential solution. She told her husband that she was disappointed him and unhappy in their marriage. The man's response surprised her. He began to assure her that he loved her and that, with time, everything would get better. He emphasized that the best way to strengthen family ties would be to have a baby. Jessica believed his words. She had not heard anything like that for a long time. After receiving a small portion of attention, she calmed down. He convinced her, or so it seemed, that he wanted children and a complete family. On May 9, 2018, the Patel couple received great news. 3 embryos were successfully fertilized. Their transfer was scheduled for the next month. This meant that soon, with the successful development of events, they would become parents. The future mom was overjoyed. She was so happy that she hurried to tell her family about everything. Everyone looked forward to the new addition, except it didn't happen. A few days later, in mysterious circumstances on the evening of May 14, 2018, the emergency service received a call from Mitesh Patel, who found his wife's dead body wrapped in duct tape at home. Gasping with shock, the man said he had left home to buy something to eat and visit colleagues at work to pick up his laptop. Upon returning home, he found his house burglarized and his wife lying unconscious. Sobbing, he added that Jessica's skin felt very cold and dark marks were visible on her neck. The dispatcher informed Patel that help was close at hand with a police unit on its way. When officers arrived on scene, they found Jessica's body on the living room floor, her wrists and ankles bound with duct tape, and a grocery store bag nearby. Unfortunately, there was nothing paramedics could do. Investigators needed to figure out what motivated such a brutal crime. Criminals were clearly searching for something, as they even ripped up the mattress of the couple's bed and discovered jewelry and cash missing. Everything appeared to point to a robbery. The husband of the murdered woman was convinced that robbers had broken into their home. In his statement, Mesh shared that, on that unfortunate day, he worked his morning shift, then proceeded to the gym after work. He returned home later in the evening. His spouse came back around 7 p.m. The man then offered to get a pizza and left the house at 7:44 p.m. Thanks to a CCTV camera at a local pizzeria, his account was confirmed. It recorded Patel placing the order. He was friendly with the staff and appeared relaxed. Before leaving the establishment, he tried calling his wife to inform her he'd be back soon, but couldn't reach her. On his way out, Mitesh decided to stop by a pharmacy, which extended his time away longer than expected. At 8:50 p.m., when he returned home, he witnessed a distressing scene. Belongings were scattered and his wife was bound. Neighbors were equally shocked by what had occurred. The neighborhood where they lived was regarded as one of the most affluent and tranquil areas. No criminal activities had ever transpired there before. Jessica's autopsy revealed strangulation as the cause of death. The attacker initially used a bag for this purpose, then resorted to using his bare hands. Finally, perhaps to ensure her demise, an electrical cord was employed as a ligature. Since there were no signs of forced entry, investigators proposed that Jessica knew her assailant and let them into the house herself. As soon as Jessica's family learned about her death, her father and sisters immediately came to support Mitesh in his grief. It's not surprising because in such tragic moments, families often rally together. They endeavored to comfort Mitesh despite knowing that the relationship between him and Jessica hadn't always been simple. The deceased woman's relatives embraced their grieving son-in-law and sought words of solace while grappling with their own sorrow. However, despite initial appearances, police harbored suspicions about the robbery scenario. After thoroughly searching the house, officers uncovered some clues that swiftly led to the criminal's apprehension and subsequent trial. Additionally, an application on Jessica's cell phone played a significant role by providing important insights into her health monitoring data at crucial times. 3 days after Jessica's murder, the lead investigator contacted her father, who was still near the crime scene. The official requested that the family return home to avoid obstructing the investigation, promising more details later. In actuality, detectives were on the verge of detaining their suspect, Sheila Patel. There were compelling reasons for Mesh's arrest. During a search of the house, authorities found a hard disk from a video surveillance camera installed by the front door. This device was located in a suitcase under the bed. It was determined that someone had damaged it just minutes before police arrived. Another critical piece of evidence was a photograph hidden under a double bottom of the couple's nightstand. It depicted Mesh in an embrace with another man named Amit. Additionally, footage from a camera installed in a house across the street showed that on May 14th, only Mesh and Jessica entered and exited their home all day. The footage captured Mesh returning at 3:30 p.m. and not leaving again. Jessica arrived at 7 p.m., parked her car, and entered their home. Mesh left for a pizza place at 7:44 p.m. and came back at 8:50 p.m. No one else entered or exited during this period, making Mesh the prime suspect. Despite this evidence making him look guilty, there was no direct proof against him yet. So detectives dug deeper into his life during their investigation. It turned out that Mesh had been hiding something significant from both his family and friends. While Jessica had suspected her husband of infidelity, she may not have known that he exclusively liked men. It increasingly seemed likely that his marriage to Jessica served as a cover for his true orientation, a heartbreaking revelation for someone who thought they had shared years of happiness with him. A terrible plan forming in Mite's head. He and his lover wanted to begin a family and become same-sex parents using Jessica's embryos and a surrogate. Patel revealed in a message that his spouse was undergoing IVF. During this time, he asked Amit if they would be together after the procedure. Amit's response was that it depended on the outcome. As their communication continued, Mite's made clear that eventually there would be no obstacles in their relationship. In a recent message, he mentioned that Jessica's days were numbered. It was later discovered that Patel was taking drugs affecting childbearing to avoid intimate relations with his wife. Investigators found incriminating evidence by reconstructing Mite's search history on the internet. His search queries were deeply revealing: how to get rid of his wife, Hindu funeral practices, procedures for obtaining insurance payments after a spouse's murder. Jessica's life was insured for £2 million. After her death, he planned to cash in on the insurance policy and use the money to buy property in Australia. In recent weeks, Patel had been searching for a suitable home to create comfortable conditions for his new family and carefully preparing for it. During the investigation of the couple's cell phones, aside from damning communications, investigators focused on an app tracking step counts on Jessica's phone. They found that since 8:04 p.m., she hadn't moved again. After 15 minutes, her phone recorded a movement of 14 steps. These seemed to be her last movements, or someone moved the device. For Mesh's activity, his phone showed high physical activity readings just before his wife's murder. His rate spiked above normal. He went up and down stairs between 7:44 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. At this point, he was staging a burglary by throwing things around the house. Before calling 911, Patel went upstairs to hide evidence, a hard drive from a surveillance camera in the pharmacy's safe. The couple owned the pharmacy. Police found stolen jewelry, 25,000 pounds, and a couple of gold bars there, items which the widower claimed had gone missing during the robbery. They also found duct tape similar to that used to bind the victim's arms and legs. The torn end of the tape matched evidence from Jessica's body. It appeared that Mesha stopped by work after the pizza party to dispose of evidence. Though he planned the crime for years, he left a mess everywhere and was careless in execution. There was no doubt about his guilt. Genetic examination of material from under Jessica's fingernails identified Mesha's DNA. Scratch marks on his neck were visible. He did not even try to hide them, claiming they resulted from a fall. During trial and afterward, Patel did not admit guilt, neither during investigation nor trial. He insisted communication with Ahit was coincidental. The trial lasted 3 weeks and established what happened. The husband attacked his wife as she entered the house. She fought back, but could not match his strength. Initially, he chose another method, a large dose of insulin found in her blood, which could have been fatal but slower than expected. Insulin overdose leads to coma and death gradually. However, anything could happen. Eventually, Mesha put a bag over Jessica's head to ensure she was dead, finally ending her life as per his plan. He strangled her with his hands, then used cord. The prosecution presented empty ampoules found in Patel's laptop bag as evidence. It took him 20 minutes to take the life of a woman who had been by his side years and shared the same house. The man exhibited incredible cruelty towards her. Afterward, he tied up his wife's hands and feet, attempting to make it look like a robbery. Following this, he drove to a pizza place as if nothing had happened and even called her. Jessica's family was in complete shock upon hearing this news. Neither side of the family could believe what they were hearing. No one would listen or believe Jessica when she sought help and support. No one even stepped in to try to understand what was happening within the family, except perhaps Jessica's sisters. The jury needed just 2 hours to reach a verdict on December 5, 2018. The court sentenced Mitesh Patel to life in prison with the right to parole after 30 years. The judge stated that it did not seem like Patel had any remorse. In all likelihood, he only felt sorry for himself. It is unlikely that the family will ever forgive him for the sin he committed. They pray for Jessica every day and remember her according to Hindu beliefs. Her soul must be reborn since she suffered greatly in life but remained a good person. In her next incarnation, she will be rewarded. At least that's the comfort her loved ones cling to as they mourn and hope for a reunion after death.